Ever notice how certain stories like just stay with you? You know, they have this power to grab you and make you care.
Yeah.
So today, we're going to dive into like the science of that, the psychology and the structure behind what makes stories so effective.
Yeah, it's fascinating how storytelling goes beyond just entertainment.
Right. It's not just about novels or movies, it's like how we communicate in every part of life.
Exactly.
We've got some excerpts from Guy Lakeman's work on story science and a document outlining this story strategy ASI layers model.
Okay.
And we're going to unpack that today, which is really cool because you can use these principles whether you're like giving a presentation or just trying to understand, the information that's coming at you constantly every day.
Yeah, it's about becoming a more effective communicator, but also a more discerning consumer of information.
Exactly. So let's start with the foundation.
Yep.
Lakeman really emphasizes this idea that a good story isn't just like a statement or a fable.
Right.
It's about presenting a problem and then a strategy for solving it.
It's that problem-solution framework that truly engages the audience.
Okay.
Think about it like this. If I just told you, look left and right before you cross the street,
Yeah.
you know what to do, but you don't necessarily know why.
Right.
It's just a set of instructions.
But a story would dig deeper.
Oh, great.
Right.
Well, is
It would paint a picture, make you feel that urgency, and that's what makes it, memorable and persuasive.
Absolutely.
Now, Lakeman gets even more granular.
Okay.
He has identified 64 key components that make up a compelling story.
64.
Yeah, 64.
Wow.
I know it's a lot.
It's a lot to unpack.
We'll get there.
Okay.
But before we get totally lost in the weeds, it's important to understand what he means by ASI.
Okay.
So ASI stands for activity, situation, and fixed attitude or manipulation. And those are the core layers of his model. And each one represents a different aspect of how a story unfolds.
So it's not just this random list of 64 things?
No,
There's a structure to it.
there's a structure to it.
Okay.
Yeah, so what do these layers actually mean in practice?
Well, think of it like building a house.
Okay.
So the activity layer is the foundation. It's all the actions and the events that drive the plot forward.
Got it.
Then you have the situation, the context, or the setting, and this kind of sets the stage and adds another dimension to the conflict.
Okay, that's 2 out of 3. What about the manipulation layer? Does that mean all stories are manipulative?
Well, not necessarily. Think of it more as the mental and emotional strategies that characters use to navigate the conflict.
Okay.
It's about understanding their motivation, their desires, their fears.
Yeah.
It could be a villain trying to deceive the hero, or it could be the hero using their wits to overcome a challenge.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So these 3 layers, activity, situation, and manipulation, they form the backbone of Lakeman's model.
They do.
And within each layer, he's identified specific components, these 64 elements that we mentioned earlier.
Right. And these components are like the building blocks of the story.
Yeah.
Like consideration, which represents the protagonist's thought process as they're evaluating their options, or pursuit, which highlights the actions they take to achieve their goals.
So taking a step back, Lakeman's model isn't just about like breaking a story into its parts.
Right.
It's about understanding how all those pieces work together to create, a complete and a compelling narrative.
It's about seeing the story as a system,
Yeah.
with each element playing a very specific role in driving that plot and engaging the audience.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could be really valuable, not just for writers, but like you were saying earlier, for anyone who wants to be a more effective communicator.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And by understanding these principles, you can start to see those patterns in the stories around you. You can analyze why some arguments are more persuasive than others, why some presentations are more engaging.
And you can use that knowledge to craft your own communication in a way that really resonates with your audience.
Exactly.
Whether you're writing a report, giving a presentation, or even just having a conversation, these principles can help you get your message across in a way that's clear, compelling, and memorable.
It's powerful stuff.
It is, and that actually brings us to another really important aspect of Lakeman's work, and that's genre.
Okay.
He doesn't just look at storytelling in general. He breaks it down into 4 distinct genres based on how the central conflict is addressed.
Right.
So we've got physical activity, where the conflict is resolved through, direct action like you see in an action movie.
Right, like a classic action
Yeah,
movie.
exactly. And then there's psychological manipulation where it's more about strategy and, outsmarting your opponent.
Like a political thriller.
Exactly.
Lots of twists and turns.
Yeah, and then we also have the antagonist's mindset genre,
Okay.
which delves into the motivations of the character who's creating the problem. you know?
Right.
It adds that layer of moral complexity.
It's not always black and white.
Right. And then finally, there's the situation genre where the conflict arises from external circumstances.
Nope. Like a natural disaster or social upheaval.
So each genre kind of has its own set of conventions and expectations,
Yes.
which influence how the story's told and how the audience interprets it.
This is getting really interesting.
It is.
So it's not just about understanding the individual components of a story. It's about seeing how those components are shaped by the genre.
Right. It's like having different lenses to view the same narrative through.
Exactly. And just like an artist chooses different colors and brushstrokes depending on, what they're painting.
Yeah.
A storyteller chooses different components and techniques depending on the genre they're working with.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, so I'm starting to see how this all fits together. It's like having a blueprint for understanding how stories work.
Yeah.
But how does this actually help someone in their daily life?
That's a great question.
Outside of writing a novel or a screenplay, absolutely, and that's something that we'll explore in more detail later on, but just to give you a taste, think about a time when you were trying to convince someone of something. Maybe you were pitching an idea at work or arguing a point with a friend.
Or maybe trying to understand a complex news story or make sense of a political debate.
Exactly. In all of those situations, you're essentially engaging in a form of storytelling.
Oh, interesting.
You're presenting a problem, offering a solution, and you're trying to persuade your audience to see things from your perspective.
So by understanding these principles of story science, we can become more aware of the techniques being used,
Absolutely.
both by us and by other people.
It's about being more intentional with your communication.
Yeah, you can start to see the underlying structure of the arguments being presented, identify potential biases, and ultimately make more informed decisions.
It's about becoming a more critical thinker and a more effective communicator.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to dive deeper into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how Lakeman's framework can help you analyze and deconstruct the stories you encounter every day, and how you can use those same principles to craft your own compelling narratives.
I'm excited to keep unpacking this.
Me too.
There's so much to explore here.
Yeah, this is great.
Okay, let's do it.
All right.
So we've laid the groundwork, exploring Lakeman's ASI model and how it breaks down those core elements of a compelling story.
Right.
But let's bring this back to you, the listener.
Okay.
How can you actually apply these concepts in your everyday life?
Yeah. I'm ready to move beyond the theory and see how this plays out.
Okay, let's start with the idea of planning.
Okay.
Just as a writer needs a blueprint, before they start building a story, understanding these story elements can help you become a more strategic communicator.
So it's not just about being a better storyteller.
No.
It's about being more intentional and effective in any situation where you need to get your point across.
Absolutely. Imagine you're preparing for a big presentation at work. Instead of just like throwing some slides together, you can use Lakeman's framework to think about the problem you're addressing, the solution you're proposing, and the key components that will make your message resonate with the audience.
So I could think about which of those 64 elements might be most impactful in this specific context.
Exactly.
Like if I'm trying to persuade my team to adopt a new strategy, I might focus on components like consideration and projection.
Okay.
To highlight the potential benefits and address any concerns they might have.
Precisely. You're essentially crafting a narrative that guides your audience through the information and leads them to the conclusion that you want them to reach.
That's super interesting. It's almost like I'm becoming like the director of my own presentation, using those storytelling techniques to create a more impactful experience.
And it goes beyond presentations. Think about how you consume information.
Okay.
We're bombarded with stories every day, from news articles to social media posts to marketing campaigns.
Yeah, it's constant.
By understanding Lakeman's model, you can start to deconstruct those messages and see the techniques being used to influence your thinking.
So I could be more discerning about the information I'm taking.
Exactly.
I can ask myself, what problem is this story trying to solve? What strategies is the author using to persuade me? Are there any biases or hidden agendas at play?
Exactly. It's about becoming a more critical and informed consumer of information, not just passively absorbing whatever's thrown at you.
This is really empowering.
It is.
It's like having a toolkit for navigating this complex world of information and communication.
It is.
But let's go back to those 4 genres that Lakeman talks about.
Okay.
How does understanding genre help us in this context?
Remember, each genre has its own set of conventions and expectations.
Right.
When you recognize the genre of a story, you start to understand the rules of the game.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's take the genre of physical activity.
Okay.
We see this all the time in sports stories or action movies. The focus is on overcoming obstacles through direct action, strength, and determination.
So if I'm watching an action movie, I'm expecting to see a lot of fight scenes, car chases, explosions.
Exactly.
I'm not necessarily expecting, deep philosophical conversations or complex character development.
Right. And when you're aware of those expectations, you can start to see how the storyteller is using those conventions to create a specific effect.
Okay.
They might use slow motion shots to emphasize the intensity of a fight scene or a soaring musical score to heighten the emotional impact.
Okay, so understanding genre helps us appreciate the craft of storytelling, but how does it apply to everyday communication?
It's about recognizing the different modes of persuasion.
Okay.
If you're trying to convince someone to join your cause, you might use elements of the physical activity genre to emphasize the need for action and urgency.
So I might use strong verbs, vivid imagery, and a call to action to mobilize my audience.
Right. But if you're trying to build trust and rapport, you might adopt a more psychological manipulation approach.
Right.
Focusing on empathy, understanding, and building a connection with your audience.
That makes sense. It's about choosing the right tools for the job, depending on the message you're trying to convey and the audience you're trying to reach.
And it's about being aware of the techniques being used by others when you encounter a persuasive message.
Okay.
Ask yourself, what genre is this story operating in? What are the conventions of this genre? How are those conventions being used to shape my perception?
It's like we've got this secret decoder ring helping us understand the hidden language of storytelling.
Absolutely.
We're starting to see the patterns and the strategies that influence how we think and feel.
And once you start to see those patterns, you can't unsee them. It's
Wow.
like gaining a superpower, the ability to navigate the world of communication with more clarity and intention.
But it's not just about analyzing other people's stories.
Right.
It's about crafting our own.
It is.
We've talked about how understanding story science can help us be more effective communicators. But can you give us some concrete examples of how we can actually apply these principles in our daily lives?
That's a great segue because in the next part of our deep dive, we'll move beyond the theoretical and into the practical. We'll explore specific examples of how you can use Lakeman's framework to improve your storytelling skills, whether you're writing an email, giving a presentation, or just having a conversation.
We've covered a lot of ground, from Lakeman's ASI model to the power of genre.
Yeah, it's been a really fascinating deep dive so far.
It has. And now let's get down to brass tacks. How can we actually use all this to become better storytellers in our own lives?
Right. It's all about application.
Yeah,
It's one thing to understand the theory, but it's another to put it into practice.
exactly. Let's say I'm writing an important email.
Okay.
Maybe trying to persuade my boss to approve a new project.
Okay.
How can Lakeman's framework help me craft a more compelling message?
Well, instead of just listing out the facts and figures,
Yeah.
you can think about framing your request as a story. Start by identifying the problem, like what's the current situation, what challenges are you facing, and then present your project as the solution.
Okay, so I'm setting up the conflict, creating a sense of need.
Exactly.
But then how do I weave in those 64 components?
Right.
It seems like a lot to juggle.
You don't have to use all of them, of course, but think about which ones might be most effective in this context.
Okay.
For example, you could use the component of consideration to show that you've carefully thought through all the implications of your project.
And maybe projection to highlight the potential benefits, not just for me, but for the whole team or even the entire company.
Right.
I'm painting a picture of a better future.
Exactly. You're using those components to create a narrative that engages your audience, making them feel invested in the outcome.
And don't forget about genre.
Oh, right.
Genre. What kind of story am I trying to tell?
That's a good question.
In this case, maybe it's a bit of a psychological manipulation story.
Okay.
I'm trying to persuade my boss, subtly appealing to their goals and motivations. I don't want to be overly aggressive, but I do want to make a strong case.
So you might use a more strategic diplomatic tone, focusing on building trust and rapport.
Okay.
You're still telling a story, but you're doing it in a way that's appropriate for the context and the audience.
Okay, so emails covered. What about presentations?
Okay.
We've touched on that a bit already, but
Right.
any other tips for using story science to create a more engaging presentation?
Well, think about your presentation as a journey. You're taking your audience on a journey from a point of problem to a point of solution. And just like any good journey, you need to keep them engaged along the way.
So how do I do that?
Okay.
Besides using those components and being mindful of genre.
Think about pacing.
Okay.
Don't overload your audience with information all at once. Build up the tension, create moments of suspense, and then release that tension with a satisfying resolution.
And I can also use visuals to help tell the story, right?
Absolutely.
Charts, graphs, images.
Yeah.
Those can all add another layer of engagement.
Visuals can be incredibly powerful, especially if they're used strategically to reinforce your message and evoke an emotional response.
This is all starting to click for me. It's not just about what I say, it's about how I say it.
Exactly.
It's about using those storytelling techniques to make my message more impactful and memorable.
And it's about being aware of those same techniques when you're on the receiving end of a story.
Okay.
When you're watching a commercial, reading a news article, or even just listening to a friend tell a story, ask yourself, what are the underlying components at play here? How is the storyteller trying to influence my thinking?
It's like we've gained this new level of awareness,
Right.
this ability to see the world through a story science lens.
And that awareness is incredibly valuable. It allows us to be more critical thinkers, more discerning consumers of information, and ultimately more effective communicators ourselves.
So to wrap things up, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
Storytelling isn't just for novelists and filmmakers. It's a fundamental part of how we communicate as human beings. And by understanding the science behind it, we can all become more powerful and persuasive storytellers in our own lives.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in diving deeper into this fascinating world, be sure to check out the show notes for links to Lakeman's work and other resources on story science. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep telling your stories.